I think sometimes people get so overwhelmed that they think, I've got to give everything up. And if I can't, then I won't give anything up. And I think it's all about making lots of small changes to the way that you eat. Because, you know, the accumulation of all those small changes over time makes a massive difference to your health. And we've all got long lives to live and plenty of time to make loads of small changes. It's so satisfying. If you say, I'm just going to do that this week, at the end of the week, if you've done it, it doesn't matter how small it is, the fact you've managed to do it is really motivating, and it can lead on to bigger things. And it sounds so small, but honestly, that's better than going on some faddy diet to try and lose weight that you're never going to stick to. One of the issues I have is if we start telling people the foods are good or bad, which I really hate, and they start cutting out all of these foods which are very healthy but are just slightly ultra-processed, how is that then going to impact on their diet? So I think we need to tread really carefully in the conversation around food choice, and it has to be of what is practical to you in your situation and where you can make the choices that are going to have the biggest impact, but not cost you the earth or make life really difficult when you're trying to feed yourself and your family.
Welcome to the Future Kind podcast, where conscious nourishment is our guide. From the cellular to the cosmic, we're exploring how our relationship with food has the power to transform the world.
Welcome. It's so good to see you.
Hey, how you doing?
Good. I've really been looking forward to this conversation because I know that you are so passionate about the potential for food to restore health and well-being and vitality and just like our overall experience of life. And I know that you've also put a lot of work into how to distill the practical information and tips that people need to experience that in their lives. So I'm really excited for our listeners to hear from you. And I'd love to start out with just you sharing a bit about your background and the work that you do in food.
Yes, so I've been a nutritionist for 20 years, a nutritionist and also a registered sports nutritionist. So I started off in public health. My work was very much around school meals, helping vulnerable groups to eat well, basically, older people in care homes, nurseries. And then I kind of moved more into working within the wellness space. So working with wellness companies, lots of retreats, private clients, all that kind of stuff. I've kind of now moved more, my focus is very much on trying to address issues around with food. A lot of work in the media. I've written several books on ultra-processed foods because I really feel like this is a really interesting point and a good place for people to start and really readdress how they eat. So, I work as a freelancer, so my work is really varied. I do lots of different stuff in lots of different capacities.
What got you interested in food? So like you've been a dietitian for 20 years, nutritionist for 20 years.
Yeah.
What started you down that path?
So I don't know what it was. I always loved cooking. Actually, my first degree was in accountancy. And I don't know, I did that for a little bit and I was like, this is not my bag at all. So, and I was always really into sport and I just loved cooking. And I just felt like moving into that space, learning more about how the human body works and how it sort of, how it works with food and really how you can heal yourself with food. I just thought it was so fascinating. But really, it's kind of the food that got me into it. And I've ended up full circled where a lot of my work now really is centered around actual cooking and food. I just love that. And I've always been really into sport and fitness. And it all just goes hand in hand, really, together.
It's interesting, though, because like a lot of people, more people are starting to realize that, but the way that caring about your body and physical health goes hand in hand with food it seems so obvious in a way, but we've become really disconnected from that. So did you always have an innate understanding of that, or was there sort of a process where those two interests converged and you had a realization about the relationship?
Do you know, I kind of always had this intuitive understanding of it. And I think it's because I did a lot of sport and I really saw how food could improve that. I was never really into eating junk food as a kid. I just was always making my own food and exploring that way and how it could help me to train a bit better in the sports that I was doing. So I've always I've always felt that. I think it's so interesting how it's all evolving a little bit. So, like Generation Z are really pushing it to another level, thinking about wellness in a more holistic fashion. So I am really interested in how that's all going, really focusing on mental health now, which that connection wasn't there when I was really interested in nutrition and diet and sport. And it really is evolving. And I think it's really exciting to see how it's moving that way and becoming a much bigger picture, environment, mental health, that really holistic vibe. It's fascinating.
Yeah, I'm so interested in how we come into the experience of it's really like a remembering, because I think there's something so innate about understanding that, of course, our food deeply affects how we feel. Like it's maybe one of the most, maybe the biggest effect that we can have. But when I reflect on my own life, I grew up doing dance, so not sport, but a similar thing where I'm I could have had that awareness, and I don't feel like I did have as much awareness. So it's so interesting to hear about you, as a kid cooking I grew up in a rural area with gardens and health conscious parents. So maybe that's part of it, is I just was well nourished. But it was also kind of an awakening for me when I first read Healing with Whole Foods in my early 20s, to just realize the degree to which my food choices were impacting everything about my experience, including emotional and mental well-being, that it just hadn't occurred to me how food was affecting that. So yeah, it's just interesting that I love picturing little Rob cooking your food as a kid. That's so cool that you just always had that innate awareness. But I guess also because part of my curiosity is of course, and I'm excited to dive into this with you, so many people don't feel well resourced to make nourishing food choices or to be in relationship with food in a way that is really optimally supportive of their well-being. And so I think this question of where does that will and capacity come from to make changes, and just how do we each come to our relationship with food is something I'm really curious about. So thanks for sharing that. It seems did you grow up in the countryside with gardens, or what was the context in which you were just making your own food?
Yeah, so I know it does sound weird now that I said it like that. No, I was brought up in a city. So I was born in a place on the seafront called Blackpool, which is right at the north of England. And then we moved to Cardiff, which is in Wales. And I think, my mum was very sick growing up. She had leukemia all my childhood, and she was very much really felt passionately that food could make a big difference. And I think a lot of it comes from that as well. I always remember, I don't know if you know that book, I've got it on my shelf here, Foods That Harm, Foods That Heal. It sounds really similar to the book that you're saying. And my mum always had it there, and she was really passionate about finding alternative ways that she could support her health. And I just remember her all the time eating tons of beetroot, because someone had told her beetroot was really good for your blood. And now we know, after studying about this, I know that it contains nitrates that help to blood vessels to dilate and improve blood flow. So it's really interesting kind of connecting the dots with all that kind of stuff. And my needing to cook, it really came from, my mum being quite ill and not being able to cook for us all the time. So, and it was very basic cooking. I'd have a jar of sauce with some meat and vegetables. But I think it's still just having that connection and understanding how to put a pan of food together. And it's put me in really good stead, and it's something I really wish that kids now would connect with. They're all very good at watching it on their phones, but, I know from experience of working with kids, and I've just written another book specifically about teenagers and kids. It's really hard to,
Awesome.
they just don't really know how to fend for themselves in the kitchen, or they don't have the tools or, the motivation or any of it to sort of get that going. But it's something I'm very passionate about. And it's this, like you said before, it's this connection, getting people connected with food again.
I am really excited to hear about that book, because, everything you just said is true of a lot of adults also.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, I'm really curious. I have a 7-year-old and a 10-year-old, and And I just can see how, like, just the impact of if kids have access to learning about the relationship with food and preparing food and all of that. I don't know, kids learn things more easily and quickly than adults. So it does seem like a valuable intervention point of like, how can kids be more resourced and teenagers? And you said you started some of your work specifically in schools. Can
Yeah,
you
I
say more about
did.
that?
I did. So I worked in the area of school meals. So I did a lot of work with all sort of vulnerable groups. So I worked with schools, and it was a lot of working with school caterers because in the UK we had these school food standards came in, which were legislated standards where you couldn't have junk food in school, what we now call UPFs. Everything had to be made from scratch. They had to meet specific standards for saturated fat, salt, sugar. So it was really about helping the staff in the schools to do that.
Wait, sorry. I just have to pause here on what you said because, like, coming from an American context, can you just say that again? So, like, schools in England, ultra processed foods are not allowed in the cafeterias?
Yeah, I guess you don't have that there, do you?
No, we
Okay,
have the
yeah.
opposite of that happening right now. That's just so fascinating to hear because we have a lot of ultra processed food in our cafeterias here, and it's so detrimental to society to have children
Yes.
while they're being educated and learning and growing not even be able to be resourced at a basic biological level with what would be necessary to be able to like have a chance at sitting still and focusing.
It started probably 15, 16 years ago, they were introduced. And
Wow.
it initially was getting vending machines out of schools because the vending machines had chocolate and crisps and fizzy drinks and all sorts of stuff. And then it was really about, like I said, improving the food that the school caterers were offering. And it was real an education for them and also quite difficult for them because they didn't have the hugest budgets. And actually, this is one of the biggest constraints we have now when we talk about this whole topic of ultra processed foods. The reason people are choosing them is because they're cheap and they're heavily marketed to people that don't have a huge food budget. So, and that includes children and teenagers. How many deals do these kids get offered on burgers when they're out with their friends and stuff like that? So I think starting in school is a really good point. And I only wish they did more education around food. So when I was at school, we did catering. And you learn really silly stuff now, like how to cut an onion properly and how to make coleslaw and a bolognese sauce and all that kind of stuff. But they just don't do it now in schools. And I find it really weird that there is not something in the curriculum that really educates kids on just the basics of cooking. And a lot of kids, even at home, if their parents can't cook, it does filter through that, they don't learn anything from their parents anymore on that point as well. So it's really difficult.
Well, I'm excited to read your new book and to keep focusing on that area. And I'm curious, like, so we're talking about ultra processed foods. Not everyone necessarily knows what that is. I would love it if you could just break that down for us and maybe even go into the explaining what the NOVA classification system is, like that level of information,
Sure.
just so people understand the different classifications of food. Because I know one of the things, part of there is some backlash against the idea of like, well, everything is processed. And so I think it's helpful for people to know kind of the details of that. And I have sensitivity around this because working on the GMO issue for almost 20 years, there's a similar rhetoric there of like, well, everything's been modified because we've been breeding plant for thousands of years. And it's like, no, there's a very specific thing when we're talking about genetically engineering. Yeah. So there's a little bit of a similar thing there. And I just think that informed choice is so important in having good, clear information. And I know that you have a lot of expertise in this. So yeah, if you could tell us what is the NOVA classification system and how does ultra processing fit into that?
Okay, so for a food to be ultra processed, just to put it into context, it means that the food is normally ready to heat, ready to eat. It will contain ingredients on the back that you probably don't recognize that you wouldn't find in your kitchen cupboards. Emulsifiers, preservatives, stabilizers, colorings, all sorts of ingredients. These foods lack fiber, so they're so heavily processed that, the fiber's been removed. They generally can be quite low in protein and they're very low in vitamins and minerals. When you look at the packets of these foods as well, they tend to be smattered in health claims, they're brightly coloured. all sorts of things, because this food has been modified to be sold to you in a certain way. In terms of the Nova classification, so this was done by a team in Brazil. That's where the original research came from. I think it was in 2010 or something that the research came out. So we've got these 4 different classifications. The first one is your unprocessed or minimally processed food. So these are foods in their whole raw state. So nuts, seeds, fruits, vegetables, lean meat, all that kind of stuff. The next set of foods are foods that are processed culinary ingredients. So these are things like oils, butter, sugar, those kind of things that will be added to group 1 to create another type of dish. Then we get group 3, which are processed foods. And I think this is where people get really confused. So a processed food is something that's just got kind of that group 1 and group 2 added to it. So it could be some fruit that's in a syrup, or it could be tuna that's been put in a can with some salt and water. Do you see what I mean? So these are foods, or some beans, pulses, and lentils that have been canned in water, or they might have some salt added to them. So that's processed. And actually, most of our food is processed. Even frozen peas are actually processed because they've been frozen, which is a process. When you get to ultra-processed food, this is, like I said before, this is when they contain all those ingredients that you really don't understand. They've gone through really lots of different processing ways of processing. They've got those ingredients that you don't recognize, stabilizers, preservatives, all the things that are there to retain the shelf life, or actually to make the food much cheaper. The reason we put these ingredients in is because we've taken something out to produce a cheap food. So if you take out fat, which could be seen as expensive in a food, you can add a stabilizer or a thickener to still give you that mouthfeel. And I know in the States, you guys have literally got so many approved additives. I think it's about 10,000 approved additives. Whereas
they're not required to be approved is more the nuance. There's like 10,000 different additives, and it's I think this is an important point to touch on. I'm glad you brought that up. Like, people assume that things that are allowed in food have gone through an approval process. And again, with the GMO issue, I've been watching people be surprised for decades of like, oh, there's no safety studies and evaluations. No, there are not. And then, there's 10,000 additives that are used in food. Some of them have gone through a review process, but it's voluntary. So how does that compare to the UK?
Well, on that point, I saw it in the news a while back. There was a lot of controversy around the FDA and approval of a lot of these claims. So in the UK, we're governed by the European Food Standards Agency. We have 400 that have been approved. So it's much smaller, and they have to go through quite a rigorous approval process. But, a lot of the research that's coming out now is that we might not really know the full story for a lot of these additives. Emulsifiers, for example, certain emulsifiers are definitely getting explored more for their impact that they might have on our gut health. And gut health seems to be where a lot of this ill health around ultra-processed foods seems to be coming from, is our gut.
Yeah.
That's been flagged as well as maybe having issues. But, there's gaps in the research, the stuff with artificial sweeteners. It's tricky with that research because the number of artificial they use, it's a very large dose on a small mouse. So we need more research to fully understand. But, definitely, I think these things that we're putting into food, even though the ones that are approved, are probably still having a detrimental effect. And mainly because people are eating so much of them, because now they're eating so much ultra-processed food. I mean, in the UK alone, we have at least 50% of the diet is UPF. And if you look at teenagers, for example, theirs can be 75, 80% of their diet is UPF. So the sheer volume
Which I
of
think,
this...
Yeah, and I think that's closer to, I think in the US, it's about 70% of calories from UPF. I'm
scary.
curious because, I think the way you're describing, like a lot of ultra processed foods, it's easy to identify. It's more like the things that we classically might think of as junk food, and we kind of know. But also, one of the things you write about in your book, Unprocess Your Life, is how, as the nutritionist, you've always been oriented to the healthfulness of eating, but then you did go on a deeper journey as you learn about ultra processed foods, that some things that seem really healthy, where you don't think that you're reaching for a junk food, actually are ultra processed and may be detrimental. So I'm curious if you could share a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. And actually, I did put that in my book. And it's so interesting because I'll tell you in a minute, but the narrative has changed in my head slightly as well since then.
Oh,
So,
yeah. Okay.
yeah, I mean, it was really, I looked at my lunch one day after I read a book on ultra-processed food. I looked at my lunch and what I thought was really healthy. I had whole grain bagels with some lean ham. I was having protein bars because I was working out a lot, protein shakes, fruit yogurts, but every single one of those foods is ultra-processed. And even though they are seen as healthy, they're still full of additives, emulsifiers, like I said, thickeners, preservatives, all that kind of stuff. So even though I was having a very healthy diet, my intake of all this stuff was still very high. I think now I have taken a slightly different tack because I just think that some of these ultra processed foods have ended up in this category, but they are still very healthy and they might only have one additive, and that might just be a preservative to extend its shelf life. So some breads now, in the UK, we don't have as many additives in our food as in the US, but bread now could just have one, wholemeal bread could just have one preservative. Weetabix breakfast cereal, it's just got barley malt extract, which actually you can buy in a health food store. But these foods are high in fiber, they've got lots of other nutrition to add to the diet. And one of the issues I have is if we start telling people the foods are good or bad, which I really hate, and they start cutting out all of these foods which are very healthy but are just slightly ultra processed, how is that then going to impact on their diet? And also, we can't start telling people just to go and buy sourdough bread, which is very expensive, if they can only afford packaged bread. And then where does that leave them in that equation? Feeling like they're not able to eat healthy because they just can't afford it. And somehow they're putting their family at risk because they're eating packaged bread. So I think we need to tread really carefully in the conversation around food choice. And it has to be of what is practical to you in your situation and where you can make the choices that are going to have the biggest impact, but not cost you the earth or make life really difficult when you're trying to feed yourself and your family.
Yeah, I really appreciate that orientation to pragmatism and just recognizing different circumstances and access. And, it does seem like there's room for further nuance within the NOVA classification system. Everything that gets lumped into group 4 is what I'm hearing from you. Like there is a lot of variation within that. I think it's helpful for people to understand that the NOVA classification, a lot of the value I see of it is it creates a basis for all of these studies that are being done to understand the impact of degree of processing and health outcomes. And so now we have a huge body of research and data demonstrating that connection that we weren't aware of before. But, so it's designed for a particular use and maybe doesn't perfectly translate into the use of, by an everyday person when they're visiting the grocery store and making decisions about what to do. And that's something that, with the work that I've been doing for the last 20 years on informed choice around GMOs, I'm just really passionate about how do people have the tools and information they need to make informed choice. So I really appreciate your orientation there. And I'd love to hear more from you about, how you advise people and just what you see in terms of recommendations for things to look for and what are ways that that are generally most accessible for average people. Because I know in your book, you have these amazing recipes and there's recommendations for how to do things like batch cooking and freezing and just how to make whole food preparation at home more accessible. And I'd love to hear about that. And then also more thoughts about what about for people who are still I am not going to cook anything in my kitchen, and, because as a mom of 2 school-age children, I can kind of appreciate that thing of working full-time, having kids. I'm fortunate to live in a place where I have a garden and an orchard, so there's food around me, but most people don't have that. So yeah, just how to make this accessible for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I think to start with, when you're thinking about how you can remove I don't say remove, because actually I don't think you need to remove all ultra-processed foods from your diet, if I'm going to be honest. I know that I will have the occasional pizza. I know that I will use a tomato cooking sauce if I'm in a rush to make a dish. So I think it's really about cutting down. And I think the first place to start really is just to look at what you're eating. Look in your pantry, look in your kitchen, really try and establish what your intake of these foods are. We put them all into our shopping trolley, but we probably don't really think about what we're eating. I think then it's about picking your weak spot across the day. So I think we all have a point during the day when we're more likely to reach for an ultra processed food. Mine would probably be lunch, because lunch is one of those things where you're busy and you don't want to be making a bowl of pasta or cooking stuff from scratch. So thinking about the weak points and thinking about how you can address those. For a lot of parents, it might be breakfast, because you've got teens that want to get up late. You've got kids that's all hectic, really speedy, quick breakfast. So instead of going for the breakfast cereal, having something to hand that is accessible, maybe you've made some breakfast muffins or whatever you've made that can be grab and go, but, just addressing that weak spot. Look at maybe making some homemade versions of your UPFs or batch cooking, just 1 or 2 dishes a week, just to experiment with cooking from scratch. And you could pick your favorite dishes. They could be your favorite family dishes. You could create a whole new family tradition where everybody gets involved with, I don't know, Taco Tuesday, or, a fake away takeaway on a Friday where everybody's getting involved in cooking and educating and learning about food and whatever it is. And understanding labels, I think, is key. You must have done some work when you do your GMO work, educating about how to read a label. Here in the UK, we have front of pack labeling where it's traffic lighted for fat, salt and sugar, so people can see very clearly what's in the food. And then on the back of the packet, you can obviously look at the ingredient list to see those rogue additives and just pick the food with the least additives. I think as well, if it's between choosing 2 UPFs, because some people might be like, all I can afford is white sliced bread. And I'm using that example again because it's such a common food. But, you just have to look at the 2 different types and just pick the best you can from what you've got, the cleanest label, if you like.
And how would people know, like, between 2 loaves of white bread? Is it mainly just looking for, like, which one has the shortest ingredient list, or are there particular, like, other tips for how to look at labels?
I think for me, it would be looking at the shortest list and just identifying any of those ingredients that you really don't recognize. So you'll know, because they have very scientific names, a lot of these, methyl cellulose, polysorbate 80, all these kind of ingredients that you'll see on the packet. And also using your common sense as well. It's still about making healthy choices in terms of nutrition. So if it is a white or brown bread, well, at least go for the brown bread because it's offering you some sort of extra nutrition. I think sometimes people get so overwhelmed that they think, I've got to give everything up. And if I can't, then I won't give anything up. And I think it's all about making lots of small changes to the way that you eat, because, the accumulation of all those small changes over time makes a massive difference to your health. And we've all got long lives to live and plenty of time to make loads of small changes. So I would say, start small, involve the whole family in this as well. If you've got, we're lucky, we probably have local markets near us, but if you can access any sort of local food, that's great as well. But yeah, just taking your time and just having fun with it a little bit as well. Have fun cooking and learning about food. Don't see it as a chore. And it could be anything. Like I said, you could go from buying a ready meal to making a really cheap basic sauce with a bit of mince, a jar of sauce. You could put half mince, you could put lentils in there to make it more plant-based. Have that with some wholemeal pasta and, you've already made a really simple dish. It might have a slightly UPF sauce because it's got 1 ingredient in that tomato sauce, but I think if you've made it as unprocessed as you can, you're on your way to having a more unprocessed life.
Yeah, I want to come back to this point about just like our relationship with food and how that plays in and all the nuance of that. But first, just want to underscore really appreciating the focus on just starting small, being practical, not feeling like you have to change everything. I mean, that's, I think, just common wisdom for any kind of changing of habits. My yoga teacher used to say, like, just get on your mat and do 1 downward dog. Like, don't think like I have to go do yoga for an hour. But then what happens in my experience is when we make a small change that we experience is nourishing and beneficial for us, then it builds the will of like, oh, and then what else could I do? And absolutely. I think one of the real challenges with food is there's this circular it's a challenge and an opportunity that there's this circular relationship between our well-being and what we're eating. And I actually really believe that like in order for us to become the humans that the future needs and be in right relationship with food and life in general, that is sourced from a sense of well-being and also clarity of mind. And food is such an important part of providing that. But it's like, how do you have the will and clarity to make changes if you're feeling crappy and have brain fog because of food? So there, it's an interesting, like, how do you start? And so I think on that point, just like small interventions is the practical way to start. And I also remember seeing a study that I think even like a 10% reduction in consumption of ultra processed food correlates with a 13% reduced risk for diabetes, which I think is just so important for people to understand, because in the US, almost, I think like 45%, almost half of adult Americans either have diabetes or are pre-diabetic. And a lot of people who are pre-diabetic don't know, but this is basically like a like common pathway for metabolic dysfunction that relates to all kinds of disease in the body and mind. And so I felt really heartened when I saw that statistic of like, okay, a 10% reduction. There's actually a significant measurable reduction in like risk of negative health outcomes. So yeah, I think the starting small. Yeah.
We see that with a lot of them as well. I mean, there was one study out, a huge study that that identified 32 different health outcomes. And there was loads of statistics like that flying around for reduced risk of cardiovascular disease, certain types of cancer like breast cancer. I mean, it's difficult with these studies because we need more studies that give us more definitive answers, because these are observational studies. So they are quite difficult to prove causality. But there's definitely something going on. And I think you're so right. Like, when you can make that change, and it's so satisfying. If you say, I'm just going to do that this week, at the end of the week, if you've done it, it doesn't matter how small it is, I've started eating brown bread instead of white. The fact you've made to do it is really, it is really motivating, and it can lead on to bigger things. And it sounds so small. When I see clients, they're like, really, that's all you want me to do? But honestly, that's better than going on some faddy diet to try and lose weight that you're never going to stick to, and I just think that is really important. And, you can pass that habit on to your kids as well. And then it just starts a different ball rolling within the family unit. So.
Yeah, this is a good moment for listeners, maybe just to pause and consider for a moment. Is there something that comes quickly to mind of like one thing that you could do this week just to try out? I love that inspiration of like, and then at the end of the week, like, yeah, I did it. And then how that might build. So just really, maybe consider that.
I think one of the things that's really challenging, though, is the environment is so hard for people to make healthy food choices in this environment. It's designed for overconsumption. We have bombarded with food, adverts, marketing, it's everywhere. And, also, if you are somebody that has an addictive tendency as well, you've got the genes, like that variation of the FTO gene that makes you overconsume food, all that kind of stuff going on. And you're in this environment where it's there 24 hours a day. It's marketed to you. It's addictive. You start eating it. You can't stop eating it. You put on more weight. I think it's just... there's just so much work that needs to be done to help people, like you said, to make informed choices in that environment. And there's some places where you don't even have access to healthy food, these so-called food deserts, and then food swamps where the only thing you can find is unhealthy food. So it's really challenging, I think. It's not as simple as just choose this or just do that. There is a lot of other stuff going on that gets in people's way, and it's trying to navigate that, I think, is the tricky bit.
Yeah. Yeah, that does really... it feels really important to acknowledge that. And it just makes me curious. It's the balance of like, how do we be empowered and also acknowledge that there are things beyond our control? So yeah, I'm just curious about the relationship there of like, it is a very challenging environment. And I also want like for each of us to be able to experience in whatever context we're in, that like we do have the power to to even a small change, whatever small change might be accessible. Because I guess partly it's just seeing that even the choices that people make in the grocery store, what I've seen with the Non-GMO Project is that has, by shoppers showing up to co-create a non-GMO food supply, that has made it possible for us to have a non-GMO food supply. So I'm really curious about that relationship of how can we move the needle on making more of the food that is packaged, that is important for convenience in a busy lifestyle, and when, cost is a significant consideration, how do we actually make more of that food nourishing? What's the potential there? Because I think, we could hope and wish that the government would do something. And it sounds like, again, like hearing about the policies in England and the cafeterias, that's amazing. I'm not holding my breath for anything like that in the US, but I know there are groups that work on that, and that's important. But it's also like, as an everyday person, how do we not feel helpless or hopeless in spite of how much the deck is stacked against us? And I'm thinking about things also like you write in Unprocess Your Life about hyper palatability, which, could you say more about what that is? Just because I think it is good for us to have compassion for ourselves of like what we're up against. It's right. It's not a simple thing of like, oh, I'm just going to do this and it'll be easy. It's these foods are designed to be addictive.
Of course, and there was some really nice research a while ago that because food addiction isn't really a recognized condition, and there are people trying to really challenge it to make it more recognized. And the food it's the mouthfeel of the food, it's the balance of the fat to sugar that sort of hits those reward centers in your brain, releasing dopamine and making you want more of these foods. They're highly flavored. Pringles, for example, they're even designed in the shape of your mouth. So they're easy to get in. They melt on your tongue. These guys even tell you once you probably can't stop, right? So they're not hiding away from it.
It's so crazy. It's been probably like 30 years since I've eaten a Pringle, but like you say Pringle and then I can feel like my reward centers in my brain light up. Like, I wouldn't enjoy eating it if I had one right now, but like I remember how enjoyable that was.
I know, and you kind of start with one and then you're into a handfuls and you're sort of ramming them into your mouth. So I think it's really, and I think it's about changing taste. This is why I wrote the book on adolescents and teenagers, because I really think starting in the home is a really good place to start. I think for parents, your kids can be a massive motivation for just you to change the whole family unit. And you don't have to have loads of money to do this. Getting your kids involved in food, understanding how to talk to your kids in a different way about healthy eating as well. Telling them to eat healthily. You say that to a teenager because it's good for you. They're going to switch off. They're going to be like, you mean boring food? It's not very flavorful. And, talking to your kids and saying, did you know that this breakfast is brilliant for your performance in that football game that you're playing? Or your daughter, I know you're concerned about your skin at this age. Let's think about foods we can include in our diet that are going to be really good for skin. Finding nice little hooks and ways in, or accessing social media. Now, there's so many brilliant food content creators out there. Having a chat about something one of those guys is making and trying to recreate it at home, or, just getting inspired. And I know that's not accessible for a lot of people. Some people are busy working parents. They might not have the nutrition literacy to even know where to start with that, or the knowledge. But I think everybody can do something in that space at home. It can be a good starting point. And I think there's ways to do it. And when we talk about convenience, this is why I talk about batch cooking and all that kind of stuff. You can create your own convenience, getting ingredients in that your kids can make a healthy meal out of themselves. Because I work with some families and I go in and they're like, it's really difficult to get my kid to eat well. But I'm like, but when I open your fridge and cupboards, all you've got is ultra processed foods. So there's nothing even in there for them to start to make something themselves, even if it's a bagel with a bit of cheese and cucumber, So I think there are ways, and the batch cooking is really important, even just semi-batch cooking stuff, chopping your veggies up so they're already made to make a stir fry or whatever it is. There's always lots of ways to try and do something.
I'm curious about how culture plays into all of this. I had a conversation with a friend and colleague recently where she was visiting her parents, where she grew up in West Virginia and rural West Virginia, and basically was saying like eating healthy is countercultural here. Like and I don't know how it compares to the UK, but in America, we're like in many communities, like like generations deep into a food culture where like that is centered around ultra processed food. And so just acknowledging the kind of social and emotional context also that can lead, in addition to just like the physical addictiveness, also how there's like, I don't have an answer to that, and I don't necessarily expect you to either, but I'm curious of your thoughts on that. And like, I think just presencing it as something for all of us to be thinking about is like the relationship, of course, such a deep relationship between food and culture and like belonging and social well-being, and just how also in that front, it's like our food choices aren't just an individual isolated choice. They can impact our sense of like who we belong to and where we fit in culture. I'm just curious, any thoughts that you have about that topic?
Yeah, I do. I mean, I could bring it back to teenagers, so I think that's the easiest place to identify it, the peer pressure to eat. Even if you want to eat well as a teenager, I think when all your friends are going to, we have shops like Greg's on the high street. It's a really cheap place to buy UPF food, really ready-made food. There's a lot of that peer pressure for them. They end up buying what their friends have because they want to seem cool. I think within communities, I mean, definitely. I think if people are used to eating a certain way, the restaurants all serve a certain type of food. Your grandma, your mum, you've all eaten that dinner on a Sunday, but actually it's all made of UPFs. I think it's quite hard to break free from that. I mean, you look at other cultures where they do it completely opposite. So a lot of Mediterranean cultures, they have their things ingrained in fresh produce and healthy living and eating together and all that kind of stuff. So I think it is a real challenge. And I think that is probably one of the hardest things, I think, trying to change those communities, all of them, to think differently. When you're getting the only food available is their mum's cooking that food, grand's cooking that food, everybody's just eating that way. It's hard. I don't have an answer, but I think even if one tries to break free, if the rest of them say, well, we don't like this, it doesn't taste like it normally tastes. I mean, it's a challenge. And I think it would take, like I said, a lot of small changes and somebody within that group that was very motivated to make those changes and take the time to do that and try and make a change. But I think it's difficult. I don't have an answer, I don't think.
Yeah. Well, I like talking about things where people don't have an answer. I think it's like it gets kind of boring if we only talk about things that we already know the answer to. So it's good to just, highlight places where it's like, oh, this is the challenge. Like one thought that comes up for me about that is because it's so important to us humans as social creatures to experience belonging. Like I'm just reflecting on my own experience of how I relate to food. And because I have the benefit of being out in the natural world a lot, I really have a relationship that's developed of like feeling the conscious awareness that with every bite of food, I am literally building my body from the body of the earth. Like our life comes from the earth, literally directly through food. I mean, in the case of UPFs, it's like gone through a lot of steps between the earth and our mouth. But still, that's the source of life for humans. And so for me, I experience a belonging to nature and the earth through my food choices that is incredibly nourishing and nurturing. And not that can replace the need and experience to also have a sense of belonging with our human community. But I just wonder about like how that can weave in as, at least some form of reconciling force there.
Yeah, I mean, this feels like a bit of an education thing and getting people more exposed to the origins of food, getting more exposed to where their food actually comes from. I mean, I'm pretty sure so many people buy food and have no idea where it comes from. I mean, on that last point, actually, when you've got these communities, I guess if you think about it, whole countries were like that. The UK was like that in the sort of 50s and 60s, all ultra-processed food. And probably when one store opened up or one health food shop, everybody turned their nose up. So I think small, little by little, when people start tasting that food and understanding how much better it is and how much better they feel, it's like we said earlier, isn't it, with the small change. When somebody sees they've made that change, it motivates them to do other stuff. But I think there is a massive problem with people not having that connection that you've just explained with their food. I think people have lost it completely. I go into schools sometimes, or I do a lot of work with charities as well with kids, teaching them about food, and they have no idea sometimes what even some of the vegetables are.
Like you actually have specifically, like you hold up vegetables and ask if they know what the name of it is. This is what I'm picturing. I'm just like checking, like any ones that come to mind where you like hold up a vegetable and they don't know what it is.
Courgettes are always called cucumbers. No idea what a courgette is, and I think they're massively freely available. People know what carrots and peas and stuff like that are, but some of the other vegetables they don't really understand. Like leeks, they don't understand what a leek is, or and I think, and it's not just about that. I think then on another level, it's even understanding, does this grow in the UK? I think that's another point as well, because, if we're going to start to the tide of time, because UPFs also have a massive impact on the environment. The fact that they travel so far, they're packaged, a lot of them use palm oil, which is causing deforestation all over the place. And the more that we want these foods and the more the demand is, the longer they travel, to get back and forth to these places that demand them. So I think, again, trying to get people to really think about where their food comes and trying to get something that's local. Here we have strawberries now sold in December. Where the hell are you getting strawberries from in December? I mean, we get them in summer here. It's associated with Wimbledon and all those great things. So, people just expect to have summer all year round now. And it's a really wrong way of thinking. And I think that is all part of it as well, which you've discussed as well at the last round table we had. It's all about the environment and understanding where food comes from, provenance, and the environmental impacts.
Yeah. And I think there's there's obviously a lot of subcultures around food. One of the inspiring things that I've seen recently is at the Non-GMO Project, we have an equity transfer program where we give grants to cover the cost of verification to BIPOC-led owned businesses. And many of those companies that we see come through with the applications for that program are preserving food cultures from other places in the world and like really oriented to nourishing their communities and like providing the familiar flavors and food. And I noticed that there are many cultures where there is still a closer connection with food. And so I think that's an interesting place when you talk about, it's an education thing, learning, like looking where are there human communities that still have really intact, healthy relationships with food, and what can we learn from that? And also thinking about, like, for me, there's the learning and education, and also just there's something empowering to me of thinking about it, like remembering. Like, I just believe that as biological beings on Earth, there is some part of us that innately understands this. Yes, there's a lot of static and things in the way of that remembering, but rather than it being something that we need to teach people, it's like inviting back into that capacity that we all have to understand how to be in right relationship with our life and the connection that has with all other life.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's just about approaching your whole life and existing in a more holistic way, isn't it? And I think you're right. People have lost touch with that. I think it's interesting what you say about the communities, because now I'm just thinking, actually, there's lots of different communities in the UK. We're massively multicultural, and where I do see a lot of the sort of healthier foods being cooked are your sort of West Indies cultures, where mum is cooking food that her mum taught her with lots of beans, pulses, that kind of thing. And the kids love that food. Or you've got maybe Southeast Asian or, Indian cultures. In those strong cultures, there's definitely a better connection with food because it's tied to the family and it's tied to tradition. I think where we've lost it is more our, English families that that don't have, generations of living in this country, that where we all have, I feel like we've really lost our connection in terms of that. And I think that, the smaller communities, or the communities that make up a lot of the UK, are definitely more connected with their food. And I think we could learn a lot of lessons from that. And I think that's why it's really important to set up new traditions as well. If you're a family and you feel like you want to make a change, I think trying to establish new traditions around food is really cool. That your kids grow up and they're like, we used to do that on a Tuesday with mum. So now I'm going to do that with my kids on a Tuesday, because it felt so good and it was a really nice memory. And I think that's really important, to build those connections. And I think that feeds into everything you're talking about. From food comes all sorts of holistic amazingness. You talk, you commune, it's just, food is the hub, isn't it, of all of it, really?
Yeah, it really is. We're coming up on our time. So thinking about the concept of this podcast, which is Future Kind, and we're really looking at like, how do we become the humans that the future needs? I think that, when we talk about food and health, it's easy to stay focused on our individual personal well-being or the well-being of our children. And that is an essential focus. And I'm really interested in like, how do we conceive of that in service of something bigger? Like that it matters that I feel well, not just so that I can enjoy my life more, but what does that make possible in terms of the contributions that I'm making in the world and how I'm showing up in relation to the rest of life? I'm just curious if you just have any advice or even an invitation of something to think about, just something to leave us with in our consideration of how we all continue to become future kind.
For me, when it comes to food, I think we all need to take responsibility. And I think that if we're eating well and we're feeling well, then we can do well for others. I think when we're not well and we're stressed and all those other things that life brings at us, I think that food really can heal you and food can bring you together. And I think that, like I said, if you're well, you're feeling well, you're probably more inspired to take care of the people around you and respect their space, do what you need to do for the environment so all of us have a chance of having a better life in the future. It's all about responsibility and it's sharing the love, I think.
Yeah. Beautiful. Rob, thank you so much. Can you tell us anything about your next book, like when that's coming out and what it's called? I'm excited about that.
So don't get too excited about the title. It's called Unprocess Your Family Life.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's coming out in January. It's available on Amazon. Hopefully we'll get a publisher in the States and it'll be available over there to you guys. But it's very much focused on the family unit and how you and your family, particularly adolescents and teens, can really unprocess your life. And it's lots of recipes that are very much tailored to the family unit.
Yeah. Awesome. I feel like that's a really good takeaway also, to just keep considering, the relationship between family, communities, and just those little, starting with one small choice, whatever feels feasible for you in your circumstances, knowing that we're up against a lot. It's a pretty insidious landscape when it comes to our food, but also with information, informed choice, we can make a difference. So thank you so much for everything you've contributed to our ability to do that. And
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing what comes next.
Great. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining us on Future Kind. Remember, every choice we make ripples through the web of life. Until next time, stay curious, stay conscious, and keep making future kind choices that nourish yourself and our world. Future Kind is brought to you by the Non-GMO Project and the Food Integrity Collective. New episodes emerge with every new and full moon. Subscribe now on your favorite podcast platform and share your Future Kind moments with us on social media using #FutureKind. Music by Yaima, Masaru Higasa, and Pepper Proud. Rise Ceremonia 6.